Today we are reading 100 Years of Solitude as part of Gorgonification studies. I couldn't find a good reading of it, so I'm going to make it myself. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Arielano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. I forgot to say that I am doing a commentary reading, so I will be pausing and giving commentary at specific points. Ice! To discover ice, we have the Wall of Ice in Game of Thrones. We have ice in the work of Frankenstein. What is ice? Ice is the great beyond. Ice is the hell of Mesoamericans. Ice is moving beyond the border. Gothic. At the time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses, built on the bank of a river of a clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. Contrast this to our world, where prepackaged ideas and idioms, these hive mind idioms, do our thinking for us. Every year during the month of March, a family of ragged gypsies would set up their tents near the village, and with great uproar of pipes and kettle drums, they would display new inventions. First, they brought the magnet, a heavy gypsy with an untamed beard and sparrow hands who introduced themselves as Melquiades, put on a bold public demonstration of what he himself called the eighth wonder of the learned alchemists of Macedonia. He went from house to house, dragging 2 metal ingots, and everybody was amazed to see pots, pans, tongs, and braziers tumble down from their places and beams creak from the desperation of nails and screws trying to emerge, and even objects that had been lost for a long time appeared from where they had been searched for most and went dragging along in their turbulent confusion behind Melquiades' magical irons. So we have a couple of concepts here. We have alchemy and Gothic already at play. And what are we talking about? We're talking about that which is on the border. That which Agamben calls on the border of life and death. That's the subject of what I'm talking about with regards to Gorgonification studies. And exactly only what is shadow banned is allowed to be destroyed, while the shadow band is what actually has the knowledge, as opposed to what is pushed in the algorithm, what is pushed in your faces. Exactly what is able to be seen is what should be questioned. What is not able to be seen should not be questioned. Those alchemists, we can look at the great thinkers such as Rumi and Shams. In the Islamic world, Rumi becomes a big deal, and Shams is quieted. He's overshadowed. Shams is shadow banned. In India, Gandhi revolts against British rule. That's the story we know. But the story we don't know, a guy, we don't even know his name. I don't even know his name. Singe. He was the violent uprising guy. But we don't know his story. Just as we know Rumi and we don't know Shams. Just as we know Gandhi and we don't know Singe or whatever other guy's name was. Everything that is shadow banned is where the truth is. When the tentacles of empire conceal our vision, and create gorgons, gorgonified people who refuse to look in the mirror. This is the practice of alchemy. Alchemy has always been a Gothic endeavor on the borders of what is possible and what is allowed. Things have a life of their own, the gypsy proclaimed with a harsh accent. It's simply a matter of waking up their souls. Jose Arcadio Buendia, whose unbridled imagination always went beyond the genius of nature and even beyond miracles and magic, though that would be thought that it would be possible to make use of the useless invention to extract gold from the bowels of the earth. Melquiades, who was an honest man, warned him, it won't work for that. But Jose Arcadio Buendia, at that time, did not believe in the honesty of gypsies. So he traded his mule and a pair of goats for the 2 magnetized ingots. Now we can see one person who has good motivations, one person who has questionable motivations. Ursula Igueren, his wife, who relied on those animals to increase their poor domestic holdings, was unable to dissuade him. Very soon we'll have gold enough and more to pave the floors of the house, her husband replied. For several months he worked hard to demonstrate the truth of his idea. He explored every inch of the region, even the riverbed, dragging the 2 iron ingots along and reciting Melquiades' incantations aloud. The only thing he succeeded in doing was to unearth a suit of 15th century armor, which had all of its pieces soldered together with rust, and inside of which there was the hollow resonance of an enormous stone-filled gourd. When Jose Arcadio Buendia and the 4 men of his expedition managed to take the armor apart, they found inside a calcified skeleton with a copper locket containing a woman's hair around its neck. In March, the gypsies returned. This time they brought a telescope and a magnifying glass the size of a drum, which they exhibited as the latest discovery of the Jews of Amsterdam. They placed a gypsy woman at one end of the village and set up the telescope at the entrance of the tent. For the price of 5 reals, people could look into the telescope and see the gypsy woman an arm's length away. Science has eliminated distance. We can think back to McLuhan as time goes faster and the world gets smaller. In a short time, man will be able to see what is happening in any place in the world without leaving his own house. A burning noonday sun brought out a startling demonstration with a gigantic magnifying glass. They put a pile of dry hay in the middle of the street and set it afire by concentrating the sun's rays. Jose Buendia, who had still not been consoled for his failure of his magnets, conceived the idea of using that invention as a weapon of war. Again, Melquiades tried to dissuade him, but he finally accepted the 2 magnetized ingots and 3 colonial coins in exchange for the magnifying glass. Ursula wept in consternation. That money was from a chest of gold coins that her father had put together over a lifetime of privation, and that she had buried underneath her bed in hopes for a proper occasion to make use of it. Jose Arcadio Buendia made no attempt to console her. Completely absorbed in his tactical experiments with the abnegation of a scientist, and even at the risk of his own life. In an attempt to show the effects of the glass on enemy troops, he exposed himself to the concentration of the sun's rays and suffered burns, which turned into sores that took a long time to heal. Over the protests of his wife, who was alarmed at such a dangerous invention, at one point he was ready to set the house on fire. He would spend hours on end in his room, calculating the strategic possibilities of the novel weapon until he succeeded in putting together a manual of startling instruction, clarity, and an irresistible power of conviction. He sent it to the government, accompanied by numerous descriptions of his experiments and several pages of explanatory sketches, by a messenger who crossed the mountains, got lost in measureless swamps, forded stormy rivers, and was on the point of perishing under the lash of despair, plague, and wild beasts, until he found a route that joined the one used by the mules that carried the mail. In spite of the fact that a trip to the capital was little less than impossible at the time, Jose Buendia promised to undertake it as soon as the government ordered him to do so that he could put on some practical demonstrations of his invention for the military authorities and could train them himself in the complicated art of solar war. Sounds like Space Wars. For several years, he waited for an answer. Finally, tired of waiting, he bemoaned to Melquiades the failure of his project, and the gypsy then gave him a convincing proof of his honesty. He gave him back the doubloons in exchange for the magnifying glass, and he left him, in addition, some Portuguese maps and several instruments of navigation. In his own handwriting, he set down a concise synthesis of the studies by monk Herman, which he left Jose Arcadio so that he would be able to make use of the astrolabe, the compass, and the sextant. Jose Arcadio Buendia spent long months of the rainy season shut up in a small room that had been built in the rear of his house so that no one would disturb him in his experiments. Having completely abandoned his domestic obligations, he spent entire nights in the courtyard watching the course of the stars, and he almost contracted sunstroke from trying to establish an exact method to ascertain noon. When he became an expert in the use and manipulation of these instruments, he conceived a notion of space that allowed him to navigate across unknown seas, to visit uninhabited territories, and to establish relations with splendid beings without having to leave his study. That was the period in which he acquired the habit of talking to himself, of walking through the house without paying attention to anyone. As Ursula and the children broke their backs in the garden, growing banana and caladium, cassava and yams, ahiyama roots and eggplants. So suddenly, without warning, his feverish activity was interrupted and was replaced by a kind of fascination. He spent several days as if he were bewitched, softly repeating to himself a string of fearful conjectures without giving credit to his own understanding. Finally, one Tuesday in December, at lunchtime, all at once he released the whole weight of his torment. The children would remember for the rest of their lives the august solemnity with which their father, devastated by his prolonged vigil and by his wrath of his imagination, revealed his discovery to them. The earth is orange. The earth is round like an orange. Oh, messed up that quote. Classic quote. Ursula lost her patience. If you have to go crazy, please go crazy all by yourself. But don't try to bring your gypsy ideas onto the heads of the children. Jose Arcadio Buendia, impassive, did not let himself be frightened by the desperation of his wife, who, in a seizure of rage, smashed the astrolabe against the floor. He built another one. He gathered the men of the village in his little room, and he demonstrated to them, with theories that none of them could understand, the possibility of returning to where one had set out by consistently sailing east. The whole village was convinced that Jose Arcadio Buendia had lost his reason when Melquiades returned to set things straight. He gave public praise to the intelligence of a man who, from pure astronomical speculation, had evolved a theory that had already been proved in practice, although unknown in Macondo until then. And as a proof of his admiration, he made him a gift that was to have a profound influence on the future of the village. The laboratory of an alchemist. But then Melquiades had aged with surprising rapidity. On his first trip, he seemed to be the same age as Jose Arcadio Buendia, but while the latter had preserved his extraordinary strength, which permitted him to pull down a horse by grabbing its ears, the gypsy seemed to have been worn down by some tenacious illness. It was, in reality, the result of multiple and rare diseases contracted on his innumerable trips around the world. According to what he himself said as he spoke to Jose Arcadio Buendia while helping him set up the laboratory, death followed him everywhere, sniffing at the cuffs of his pants, but never deciding to give him the final clutch of its claws. He was a fugitive from all the plagues and catastrophes that had ever lashed mankind. He had survived pelegria in Persia, scurvy in Malayan archipelago, leprosy in Alexandria, Berbery in Japan, bubonic plague in Madagascar, an earthquake in Sicily, and a disastrous shipwreck in the Strait of Magellan. That prodigious creature said to possess the keys of Nostradamus was a gloomy man, enveloped in a sad aura, with an Asiatic look that seemed to know what there was on the other side of things. He wore a large black hat that looked like a raven, with widespread wings, and the velvet vest across which the patina of the centuries had skated. But in spite of his immense wisdom and his mysterious breadth, he had a human burden, an earthly condition that kept him involved in the small problems of daily life. He would complain of the ailments of old age. He suffered from the most insignificant economic difficulties, and he had stopped laughing a long time back because scurvy had made his teeth drop out. On that suffocating noontime when the gypsies revealed his secrets, Jose Arcadio Buendia had the certainty that it was the beginning of a great friendship. So, something important about the noon here. That's a repeated motif. The children were startled by his fantastic stories. Aureliano, who could not have been more than 5 at the time, would remember him for the rest of his life, as he saw him that afternoon, sitting against the metallic and quivering light from the window, lighting up with his deep organ voice the darkest reaches of the imagination, while down over his temples there flowed the grease that was being melted by the heat. Jose Arcadio, his older brother, would pass on that wonderful image as a hereditary memory of all his descendants. Ursula, on the other hand, held a bad memory of the visit, for she had in turn entered the room just as Melquiades had carelessly broken a flask of bichloride of mercury. "It's the smell of the devil," she said. "Not at all," Melquiades corrected her. "It has been proven that the devil has sulfuric properties, and this is just a little corrosive sublimate." Always didactic, he went into a learned exposition of diabolical properties of cinnabar, but Ursula paid no attention to him, although she took the children off to pray. That biting odor would stay forever in her mind, linked to the memory of Melquiades. Amazing. This is a powerful line here. The Melquiades as Mercury, as a classic alchemy sign. And then we have the sulfuric properties of the devil. And his didactic ways, however, are devilish. So this is interesting. The rudimentary laboratory, in addition to a profusion of pots, funnels, retorts, filters, and sieves, was made up of a primitive water pipe, a glass beaker with a long, thin neck, a reproduction of the philosopher's egg, and still the gypsies themselves had built in accordance with modern descriptions of 3-armed alembic of Mary the Jew. Along with these items, Melquiades left samples of the 7 metals that corresponded to the 7 planets, the formulas of Moses and Zosimus for doubling the quantity of gold, and a set of notes and sketches concerning the processes of the great teaching that would permit those who could interpret them to undertake the manufacture of the philosopher's stone. I know what the philosopher's stone is. The philosopher's stone is the sun of Plato's cave, looking at something from all the perspectives, whereas the fire in Plato's cave is one perspective only: the good logos and the deceitful logos. Seduced by the simplicity of the formulas to double the quantity of gold, Jose Arcadio Buendia paid court to Ursula for several weeks so that she would let him dig up her colonial coins and increase them as many times as it was possible to subdivide Mercury. Ursula gave in, as always, to her husband's unyielding obstinacy. Then Jose Arcadio Buendia threw 3 doubloons into a pan and fused them with copper filings, orpiment, brimstone, and lead. He put it all into a boil of castor oil until he got a thick and pestilential syrup, which was more like common caramel than valuable gold. In risky and desperate processes of distillation, melted with 7 planetary metals, mixed with hermetic mercury and vitriol of Cyprus, and put back to cook in a hog fat for lack of any radish oil. He's not even following his own recipe. He put hog fat for radish oil. Ursula's precious inheritance was reduced to a large piece of burnt hog cracklings that was firmly stuck to the bottom of the pot. When the gypsies came back, Ursula had turned the whole population of the village against them. But curiosity was greater than fear. For that time, the gypsies went about the town, making a deafening noise with all manner of musical instruments, while a hawker announced the exhibition of the most fabulous discovery of the Nassians, so that everyone went to the tent, and by paying 1 cent, they saw a youthful Melquiades, recovered, unwrinkled, with a new and flashy set of teeth. Those who remembered his gums that had been destroyed by scurvy, his flaccid cheeks, and his withered lips, trembled with fear at the final proof of the gypsies' supernatural power. The fear turned into panic when Melquiades took out his teeth, intact, encased in their gums, and showed them to the audience for an instant. A fleeting instant in which he went back to being the same decrepit old man of the years past, and put them back again and smiled once more with the full control of his restored youth. Even Jose Arcadio Buendia himself considered that Melquiades' knowledge had reached unbearable extremes, but he felt a healthy excitement when the gypsies explained to him alone the workings of his false teeth. It seemed so simple and so prodigious at the time that overnight he lost all interest in his experiments in alchemy. He underwent a new crisis of bad humor. He did not go back to eating regularly, and he would spend the day walking through the house. "Incredible things are happening in the world," he said to Ursula. "Right there across the river, there are all kinds of magical instruments while we keep it living like donkeys." Those who had known him since the foundation of Macondo were startled at how much he had changed under Melquiades' influence. At first, Jose Arcadio Buendia had been a kind of youthful patriarch who would give instructions for planting and advice for raising the children of animals, who collaborated with everyone, even in the physical work, for the welfare of the community. Since his house from the very first had been the best in the village, the others had been built on its image and likeness. It had a small, well-lighted living room and a dining room in the shape of a terrace with gaily colored flowers, 2 bedrooms, a courtyard with a gigantic chestnut tree, a well-kept garden, a corral where goats, pigs, and hens lived in peaceful communion. The only animals that were prohibited, not just in his house, but in the entire settlement, were fighting cocks. Ursula's capacity for work was the same as that of her husband. Active, small, severe. That woman of unbearable nerves who at no moment in her life had been heard to sing seemed to be everywhere, from dawn until quite late at night, always pursued by the soft whispering of her stiff, starched petticoats. Thanks to her, the floors of tamped earth, the unwhited washed mud walls, the rustic wooden furniture they had built themselves were always clean, and the old chests where they kept their clothes exhaled the warm smell of basil. Jose Arcadio Buendia, who was the most enterprising man ever to be seen in the village, had set up the placement of the houses in such a way that from all of them one could reach the river and draw water with the same effort. And he had lined up all the streets with such good sense that no house got more sun than another during the hot time of day. Within a few years, Macondo was a village that was more orderly and hardworking than any known until then by its 300 inhabitants. It was truly a happy village where no one was over 30 years of age and where no one had died. Since the time of its founding, Jose Arcadio Buendia had built traps and cages. In a short time, he filled not only his own house with all of those in the village with troupials, canaries, bee-eaters, and redbreasts. The concert of so many different birds became so disturbing that Ursula would plug her ears with beeswax so as not to lose her sense of reality. The first time Melquiades' tribe arrived, selling glass balls for headaches, everyone was so surprised that they had been able to find the village lost in the drowsiness of the swamp, and the gypsies confessed that they had found their way by the song of the birds. The song of the birds. Here we have Minervan energy. The spirit of social initiative disappeared in a short time, pulled away by the fever of magnets, astronomical calculations, the dream of transmutation, and the urge to discover the wonders of the world. From a clean and active man, Jose Arcadio Buendia changed into a man lazy in appearance, careless in his dress, wild beard that Ursula managed to trim with great effort, and a kitchen knife. There were many who considered him the victim of some strange spell. But even those most convinced of his madness left work and family to follow him when he brought out his tools to clear the land and asked the assembled group to open a way that would put Macondo in contact with the great inventions. Jose Arcadio Buendia was completely ignorant of the geography of the region. He knew that to the east there lay an impenetrable mountain chain, and that on the other side of the mountains there was an ancient city of Riohacha, where in times past, according to what he had been told by the first Arellano Buendia, his grandfather, Sir Francis Drake had gone crocodile hunting with cannons, and that he repaired them and stuffed them with a straw to bring to Queen Elizabeth. In his youth, Jose Arcadio Buendia and his men, with wives and children, animals, and all kinds of domestic implants, had crossed the mountains in search of an outlet to the sea. And after 26 months, they gave up the expedition and found Macondo, so they would not have to go back. It was, therefore, a route that did not interest him, for it could lead only to the past. To the south lay the swamps covered with eternal vegetable scum, and the whole vast universe of the great swamp, which the gypsies had said, had no limits. The great swamp in the west mingled with a boundless extension of water where there were soft-skinned cetaceans that had the head and torso of a woman, causing the ruination of sailors with the charm of their extraordinary breasts. These are the gorgons. The gypsies sailed along through along that route for 6 months before they reached the strip of land over which the mules that carried the mail passed. According to the Jose Arcadio Buendia's calculations, or the sirens, according to his calculations, the only possibility of contact with civilization lay along the northern route. So he handed out clearing tools and hunting weapons to the same men who had been with him during the founding of Macanto. He threw his directional instruments and his maps into a knapsack, and he undertook the reckless adventure. During the first days, they did not come across any appreciable obstacle. They went down along the stony bank of a river to the place where years before they had found the soldier's armor, and from there they went into the woods along a path between wild orange trees. At the end of the first week, they killed a roasted deer, but they agreed to eat only half of it and salt the rest for the days that lay ahead. With that precaution, they had tried to postpone the necessity of having to eat macaws, whose blue flesh had a harsh and musky taste. Then, for more than 10 days, they did not see the sun again. The ground became soft and damp, like volcanic ash, and the vegetation was thicker and thicker. And the cries of the birds and the uproar of the monkeys became more and more remote, and the world became eternally sad. The men on the expedition felt overwhelmed by their most ancient memories in that paradise of dampness and silence, going back to before original sin, as their boots sank into pools of steaming oil and their machetes destroyed bloody lilies and golden salamanders. For a week, almost without speaking, they went ahead like sleepwalkers through a universe of grief, lighted only by tenacious reflection of luminous insects, and their lungs were overwhelmed by a suffocating smell of blood. They could not return because the strip that they were opening as they went along would soon close up, with a new vegetation that almost seemed to grow before their eyes. It's all right, Jose Arcadio Buendia says. The main thing is not to lose our bearings. Always following his compass, he kept on guiding his men towards the invisible north so that they would be able to get out of that enchanted region. It was a thick night, starless, but the darkness was becoming impregnated with a fresh and clear air. Exhausted by a long crossing, they hung up their hammocks and slept deeply for the first time in 2 weeks. When they woke up, with the sun already high in the sky, they were speechless with fascination. Before them, surrounded by ferns and palm trees, white and powdery in the silent morning light, was an enormous Spanish galleon. Tilted slightly to the starboard, it had hanging from its intact mast the dirty rags of its sails in the midst of its rigging, which were adorned with orchids. The hull, covered with an armor of petrified barnacles and soft moss, was firmly fastened into a surface of stones. The whole structure seemed to occupy its own space, one of solitude and oblivion, protected from the vices of time and the habits of the birds. Inside, where the expeditionaries explored with careful intent, there was nothing but a thick forest of flowers. The discovery of the galleon, an indication of the proximity of the sea, broke Jose Arcadio Buendia's drive. He considered it a trick of his whimsical fate to have searched for the sea without finding it, at the cost of countless sacrifices and suffering, and to have found it all of a sudden without looking for it, as if it lay across the path like an insurmountable object. Many years later, Buendia crossed the region again when it was already a regular mail route, and the only part of the ship he found was its burned out frame in the midst of a field of poppies. Only then, convinced that the story had not been the same product of his father's imagination, did he wonder how the galleon had been able to get inland to that spot. But Jose Arcadio Buendia did not concern himself with that when he found the sea after another 4 days' journey from the galleon. His dreams ended as he faced that ashen, foamy, dirty sea, which had not merited the risks and sacrifices of the adventure. God damn it! Macondo is surrounded by water on all sides. The idea of peninsular Macondo perceived for a long time, inspired by the arbitrary map that Jose Arcadio Buendia sketched on his return from the expedition. He drew it in a rage, evilly exaggerating the difficulties of communication as if to punish himself for the absolute lack of sense with which he had chosen the place. We'll never get anywhere, he lamented to Ursula. We're going to rot our lives away here without receiving the benefits of science. That certainty, mulled over for several months in the small room he had used as a laboratory, brought him to the conception of the plan to move Macondo to a better place. But that time, Ursula had anticipated his feverish designs. With the secret and implacable labor of a small ant, she predispositions the women of the village against the flightiness of their husbands, who were already preparing for the move. Jose Arcadio Buendia did not know at that moment, or because of what adverse forces his plan had become enveloped in a web of pretexts, disappointments, and evasions, until it turned into nothing but an illusion. Ursula watched him with the innocent attention and even felt some pity for him on the morning when she found him in the back room muttering about his plans for moving as he placed his laboratory pieces in their original boxes. She let him finish. She let him nail up the boxes and put his initials on them with an inked brush without reproaching him, but knowing now that he knew because she had heard him say so in his soft monologues, that the men of the village would not back him up in his undertaking. Only when he had began to take down the door of the room did Ursula dare ask him what he was doing, and he answered with a certain bitterness, "Since no one wants to leave, we'll leave all by ourselves." Ursula did not become upset. "We will not leave," she said. "We will stay here because we have a son here." "We have still not had a death," he said. "A person does not belong to a place until there is someone dead under the ground." Ursula replied with a soft firmness, "If I have to die for the rest of you to stay here, I will die." Jose Arcadio Buendia, foreshadowing, had not thought that his wife's will was so firm. He tried to seduce her with the charms of his fantasy, with the promise of a prodigious world where all one had to do was sprinkle some magic liquid on the ground and the plants would bear fruit whenever a man wished, and where all manner of instruments against pain were sold at bargain prices. But Ursula was insensible to his clairvoyance. "Instead of going around thinking about your crazy inventions, you should be worrying about your sons. Look at the state they're in, running wild, just like donkeys." Jose Arcadio Buendia took his wife's words literally. He looked out the window and saw the barefoot children in the sunny garden, and he had impression that only at that instant had they begun to exist, conceived by Ursula's spell, her words. Something occurred inside of him then, something mysterious and definitive that uprooted him from his own time and carried him adrift to an unexplored region of his memory. While Ursula continued sweeping the house, which was safe now from being abandoned for the rest of her life, he stood there with an absorbed look, contemplating the children until his eyes became moist, and he dried them with the back of his hand, exhaling a deep sigh of resignation. "All right," he said. "Tell them to come help me take the things out of the boxes." Jose Arcadio, the older of the children, was 14. He had a square head, thick hair, and his father's character. Although he had the same impulse for growth and physical strength, it was early evident that he lacked imagination. He had been conceived and born during the difficult crossings of the mountains before the founding of Macondo, and his parents gave thanks to heaven when they saw he had no animal features. Oriolano, the first human being to be born in Macondo, would be 6 years old in March. He was silent and withdrawn. He had wept in his mother's womb and had been born with his eyes open. As they were cutting the umbilical cord, he moved his head from side to side, taking in the things in the room and examining the faces of the people with a fearless curiosity. Then, indifferent to those who came close to look at him, he kept his attention concentrated on the palm roof, which looked as if it were about to collapse under the tremendous pressure of rain. Ursula did not remember the intensity of that look again until one day when our little Arielano, at the age of 3, went into the kitchen at the moment she was taking a pot of boiling soup from the stove and putting it on the table. The child, perplexed from the doorway, said, "It's going to spill." The pot was firmly placed at the center of the table, but just as soon as the child made his announcement, it began an unmistakable movement towards the edge, as if impelled by some inner dynamism, and it fell and broke on the floor. Ursula, alarmed, told her husband about the episode, but he interpreted it as a natural phenomenon, that was the way he always was, alien to the existence of his sons, partly because he considered childhood as a period of mental insufficiency, and partly because he was always too absorbed in his fantastic speculations. But since the afternoon, when he called the children in to help him unpack the things in the laboratory, he gave them his best hours. In the small separate room where the walls were gradually being covered by the strange maps and fabulous drawings, he taught them to read and write and do sums. And he spoke to them about the wonders of the world, not only where his learning had extended, but forcing the limits of his imaginations to the extremes. It was in that way that the boys ended up learning that the southern extremes of Africa, there were men so intelligent and peaceful that their only pastime was to sit and think, and that it was possible to cross the Aegean Sea on foot by jumping from island to island all the way to the port of Salonika. Those hallucinating sessions remained printed on the memories of the boys in such a way that many years later, a second before the regular army officer gave that firing squad command to fire, Colonel Aureliano Buendia saw once more that the warm March afternoon on his father had interrupted the lessons in physics and stood fascinated with his hands in the air and his eyes motionless, listening to the distant pipes, drums, and jingles of the gypsies who were coming to the village once more, announcing the latest and most startling discovery of the sages of Memphis. They were the new gypsies, young men and women who had only their own language, handsome specimens with oily skins and intelligent hands, whose dances and music sowed a panic of uproarious joy through the streets, with parrots painted all colors, reciting Italian arias, and a hen who laid 100 golden eggs to the sound of a tambourine, and a trained monkey who reads minds, and a multiple-use machine that could be used at the same time to sew on buttons and reduce fevers, and the apparatus to make a person forget his bad memories, and a poultice to lose time, and 1,000 more inventions so ingenious and unusual that Jose Arcadio Buendia must have wanted to invent a memory machine so that he can remember them all. In an instant, they transformed the village. The inhabitants of Macondo found themselves lost in their own streets, confused by the crowded fair. Holding a child by each hand so as to not lose them in the tumult, bumping into the acrobats with golden caped teeth and jugglers with 6 arms suffocated by the mingled breath of manure and sandals that the crowd exhaled. Jose Arcadio Buendia went about everywhere like a madman, looking for Melquiades so he could reveal to him the infinite secrets of the fabulous nightmare. He asked several gypsies who did not understand his language. Finally, he reached the place where Melquiades used to set up his tent, and he found a taciturn Armenian who, in Spanish, was hawking a syrup to make oneself invisible. He had drunk down a glass of the amber substance in one gulp as Jose Arcadio Buendia elbowed his way through the absorbed group that was witnessing the spectacle and was able to ask his question. The gypsy wrapped him in a frightful climate of his look before he turned into a puddle of pestilential and smoke pitch over which the echo of his reply still floated. Melquiades is dead. Upset by the news, Jose Arcadio Buendia stood motionless, trying to rise above his affliction until the group dispersed, called away by other artifices, and the puddle of the taciturn Armenian evaporated completely. Other gypsies confirmed later on that Melquiades in fact succumbed to the fever on the beach of Singapore, and that his body had been thrown into the deepest part of the Java Sea. The children had no interest in the news. They insisted that their father take them to see the overwhelming novelty of the sages of Memphis that was being advertised as the entrance of a tent that, according to what was said, who had once belonged to King Solomon. They insisted so much that Jose Arcadio Buendia paid 30 reals and led them into the center of the tent, where there was a giant with a hairy torso and a shaved head, with a copper ring in his nose and a heavy iron chain on his ankle, watching over a pirate chest. When it was opened by the giant, the chest gave a glacial exhalation. Inside, there was only an enormous transparent block with infinite internal needles in which the light of the sunset was broken up into colored stars. Disconcerted, knowing that the children were waiting for an immediate explanation, Jose Arcadio Buendia ventured to murmur, It's the largest diamond in the world." "No," gypsies countered. "It's ice." Jose Arcadio Buendia, without understanding, stretched out his hand towards the cake, but the giant moved it away. "5 reals more to touch it," he said. Jose Arcadio Buendia paid them and put his hand on the ice and held it there for several minutes, as his heart filled with fear and jubilation at the contact with mystery. Without knowing what to say, he paid 10 more reals so that his sons could have that prodigious experience. Little Jose Arcadio refused to touch it. Arielano, on the other hand, took a step forward and put his hand on it, withdrawing it immediately. "It's boiling," he exclaimed, startled. But his father paid no attention to him. Intoxicated by the evidence of the miracle, he forgot at that moment about the frustration of his delirious undertakings and Melquiades' body, abandoned to the appetite of his squids. He paid another 5 reals, and with his hand on the cake, as if giving testimony to the Holy Scripture, he exclaimed, "This is the great invention of our time." When the pirate Sir Francis Drake attacked Riocada in the 16th century, Ursula Iguaran, great-great-grandmother, became so frightened with the ringing of alarm bells and the firing of cannons that she lost control of her nerves and sat down on a light stove. The burns changed her into a useless wife for the rest of her days. She could only sit on one side, cushioned by pillows, and something strange must have happened to her way of walking, for she never walked again in public. She gave up all kinds of social activity, obsessed with the notion that her body gave off a singed odor. Dawn would find her in the courtyard, for she did not dare fall asleep, lest she dream of the English and their ferocious attack dogs as they came through the windows of her bedroom to submit her to shameful tortures with their red-hot irons. Her husband, an Aragonese merchant by whom she had 2 children, spent half the value of his store on medicines and pastimes in an attempt to alleviate her terror. Finally, he sold the business and took the family to live far from the sea in a settlement of peaceful Indians located in the foothills, where he built his wife a bedroom without windows so that pirates of her dreams would have no way of getting in. In that hidden village, there was a native-born tobacco planter who had lived there for some time, Don Jose Arcadio Buendia, with whom Ursula's great great grandfather established a partnership that was so lucrative that within a few years they made a fortune. Several years later, the great great grandson of the native born planter married the great great granddaughter of the Aragonese. Therefore, every time that Ursula became exercised over her husband's mad ideas, she would leap back over 300 years of fate and curse the day that Sir Francis Drake had attacked Ryokada. It was simply a way of giving herself some relief, because actually they were joined till death by a bond that was more solid than love, a common prick of conscience. They were cousins. They had grown up together in the old village that both of their ancestors, with their work and good habits, had transformed into one of the finest towns in the province. Although their marriage was predicted from time to time, from the time that they had come into the world, when they expressed their desire to be married, their own relatives tried to stop it. They were afraid that those two healthy products of two races that had interbred over the centuries would suffer the shame of breeding iguanas. There had always been a horrible precedent. An aunt of Ursula's, married to an uncle of Jose Arcadio Buendia, had a son who went through life wearing loose, baggy trousers and who bled to death after having lived 42 years in the purest state of virginity, for he had been born and had grown up with a cartilaginous tail in the shape of a corkscrew, and with a small tuft of her hair on the tip, a pig's tail that had never allowed to be seen by any woman, and that cost him his life when a butcher's friend did him the favor of chopping it off with his cleaver. Jose Arcadio Buendia, with the whimsy of his 19 years, resolved the problem with a single phrase: I don't care if I have piglets as long as they can talk. So they were married amidst a festival of fireworks and a brass band that went on for 3 days. They would have been happy from then on if Ursula's mother had not terrified her with all manner of sinister predictions about their offspring, even to the extreme of advising her to refuse to consummate the marriage. Fearing that her stout and wilful husband would rape her while she slept, Ursula, before going to bed, would put on rudimentary kinds of drawers that her mother had made out of sailcloth and had reinforced with a system of crisscrossed leather straps that was closed in the front by a thick iron buckle. That was how they lived for several months. During the day, he would take care of his fighting cocks, and she would do frame embroidery with her mother. At night, they would wrestle for several hours in an anguish violent that seemed to be a substitute for the act of love, until the popular intuition got a whiff of something irregular, and the rumor spread that Ursula was still a virgin a year after her marriage because her husband was impotent. Jose Arcadio Buendia was the last one to hear the rumor. Look at what the people are saying, Ursula, he told his wife very calmly. Let them talk. We know that it's not true. So the situation went on the same way for another 6 months, until the tragic Sunday when Jose Arcadio Buendia won a cockfight from Prudencio Aguilera. Furious, aroused by the blood of his bird, the loser backed away from Jose Arcadio Buendia so that everyone in the cockpit could hear what he was going to tell them. Congratulations! Maybe that rooster of yours can do your wife a favor. Jose Arcadio Buendia serenely picked up his rooster. I'll be back, he told everyone, and then to Prudencio Aguilera, you go home and get a weapon, because I'm going to kill you. 10 minutes later, he returned with the notch spear that had belonged to his grandfather. At the door of the cockpit, where half the town had gathered, Prudencio Aguilera was waiting for him. There was no time to defend himself. Jose Arcadio's spear, thrown with the strength of a bull and with the same aim with which the first Aureliano Buendia had exterminated the jaguars from the region, pierced his throat. That night, as they held awake over the corpse in the cockpit, Jose Arcadio Buendia went into the bedroom of his wife was went into the bedroom as his wife was putting on her chastity pants. Pointing the spear at her, he ordered, "Take them off." Ursula had no doubt that about her husband's decisions. "You'll be responsible for what happens," she murmured. Jose Arcadio Buendia stuck the spear into the dirt floor. "If you bear iguanas, we'll raise iguanas. But there'll be no more killings in this town because of you." It was a fine June night, cool with a moon, and they were awake and frolicking in bed until dawn, indifferent to the breeze that passed through the bedroom, loaded with the weeping of Prudencio Aguilar's kin. The matter was put down as a duel of honor, but both of them were left with a twinge in their conscience. One night, when she could not sleep, Ursula went out into the courtyard to get some water, and she saw Prudencio Aguilar by the water jar. He was livid, a sad expression on his face, trying to cover the hole in his throat with a plug made of esparato grass. It did not bring on fear in her, but pity. She went back to the room and told her husband what she had seen, but he did not think much of it. "This just means that we can't stand the weight of our conscience." 2 nights later, Ursula saw Prudencio Aguilar again in the bathroom, using the esparato plug to wash the clotted blood from his throat. On another night, she saw him strolling in the rain. Jose Arcadio Buendia, annoyed by his wife's hallucinations, went out in the courtyard and armed with a spear. There was the dead man with his sad expression. "You'll go to hell," Jose Arcadio Buendia shouted at him. "Just as many times as you come back, I'll kill you again." Prudencio Aguilar did not go away, nor did Jose Arcadio Buendia's dare throw the spear. He never slept well after that. He was tormented by the immense desolation with which the dead man had looked at him through the rain, his deep nostalgia as he yearned for living people, the anxiety with which he searched through the house looking for some water with which to soak his esparato plug. "He must be suffering a great deal," he said to Ursula. "You can see that he's so very lonely." She was so moved that the next time she saw the dead man uncovering the pots on the stove, she understood what he was looking for. And then from then on, she placed water jugs all about the house. One night, when he found him washing his wound in his own room, Jose Arcadio Buendia could no longer resist. "It's all right, Prudencio. We're going to leave this town, just as far away we can go, and we'll never come back. Go in peace now." That was how they undertook the crossing of the mountains. Several friends of Jose Arcadio Buendia, young men like him, excited by the adventure, dismantled their houses and packed up, along with their wives and children, to head towards the land that no one had promised them. Before he left, Jose Arcadio Buendia buried the spear in the courtyard, and one after another, he cut the throats of his magnificent fighting cocks, trusting that in that way he could give some measure of peace to Prudencio Aguilar. All that Ursula took along were a trunk with her bridal clothes, a few household utensils, and the small chest with the gold pieces that she had inherited from her father. They did not lay out any definite itinerary. They simply tried to go in a direction opposite to the road to Rioja, so that they would not leave any trace or meet any people they knew. It was an absurd journey. After 14 months, her stomach, corrupted by monkey meat and snake stew, Ursula gave birth to a son that had all of his features human. She had traveled half of the trip in a hammock that 2 men carried on their shoulders, because swelling had disfigured her legs and her varicose veins had puffed up like bubbles. Although it was pitiful to see them with their sunken stomachs and languid eyes, the children survived the journey better than their parents, and most of the time it was fun for them. One morning, after almost 2 years of crossing, they became the first mortals to see the western slopes of the mountain range. From the cloudy summit, they saw the immense aquatic expanse of the great swamp as it spread out towards the side of the world. But they never found the sea. One night, after several months of lost wandering through the swamps, far away now from the last Indians that they had met on their way, they camped on the banks of a stony river whose waters were like a torrent of frozen glass. Years later, during the Civil War, Colonel Aurelio Buendia tried to follow the same route in order to take Rioja by surprise, and after 6 days of traveling, he understood that it was madness. Nevertheless, the night on which they camped beside the river, his father's host had looked of shipwrecked people with no escape, but their number had grown during the crossing, and they were all prepared, and they succeeded, to die of old age. Jose Arcadio Buendia dreamed that the night was right. There, a noisy city with houses having mirror walls rose up. He asked what city it was, and they answered him with a name that he had never heard, that had no meaning at all, but had supernatural echo in his dream. Macondo. On the following day, he convinced his men that they would never find the sea. He ordered them to cut down the trees to make a clearing beside the river at the coolest spot on the bank, and there they would found the village. Jose Arcadio Buendia did not succeed in deciphering the dream of houses with mirror walls until the day he discovered ice. Then he thought he understood its deep meaning. He thought that in the future they would be able to manufacture blocks of ice on a large scale from such a common material as water, and with them build new houses of the village. Macondo would no longer be a burning place where the hinges and doors knockers twisted with the heat, but would be changed into a wintry city. If he did not persevere in his attempts to build an ice factory, it was because at that time he was absolutely enthusiastic over the education of his sons, especially that of Arielano, who from the first had revealed a strange intuition for alchemy. The laboratory had been dusted off. Reviewing Melquiades' notes, serene now, without the exaltation of novelty, in prolonged and patient sessions, they tried to separate Ursula's gold from the debris that was stuck to the bottom of the pot. Young Jose Arcadio scarcely took part in the process, while his father was involved body and soul with his water pipe. The willful firstborn, who had always been too big for his age, had become a monumental adolescent. His voice had changed. An incipient fuzz appeared on his upper lip. One night, as Ursula went into the room where he was undressing to go to bed, she felt a mingled sense of shame and pity. He was the first man that she had seen naked after her husband, and he was so well equipped for life that he seemed abnormal. Ursula, pregnant for the third time, relived her newly wed terror. Around the time, a merry, foul-mouthed, provocative woman came to the house to help with the chores, and she knew how to read the future in cards. Ursula spoke to her about her son. She thought that his disproportionate size was something as unnatural as her cousin's tail of a pig. The woman let out an expansive laugh that resounded through the house like a spray of broken glass. Just the opposite. He'll be very lucky. In order to confirm her predictions, she brought her cards to the house a few days later and locked herself up with Jose Arcadio in a granary off the kitchen. She calmly placed her cards on the old carpenter's bench, saying anything that came into her head, while the boy waited beside her, more bored than intrigued. Suddenly, she reached out her hand and touched him. Lord, she said, sincerely startled, and that was all she could say. Jose Arcadio felt his bones filling up with foam, a languid fear, a terrible desire to weep. The woman made no insinuations, but Jose Arcadio kept looking for her all night long, for the smell of smoke that she had under her armpits and that had got caught under his skin. He wanted to be with her all the time. He wanted her to be his mother, for them never to leave the granary, and for her to say, "Oh Lord," to him. One day he could not stand it any more, and he went looking for her at the house. He made a formal visit, sitting uncomprehendingly in the living room without saying a word. At that moment he had no desire for her. He found her different, entirely foreign to the image that her smell brought on, as if she were someone else. Her drink He drank his coffee and left the house in depression. Then that night, during the frightful time of lying awake, he desired her again with a brutal anxiety. But he did not want her that time as she had been in the granary, but as she had been in that afternoon. Days later, the woman suddenly called him to her house, where she was alone with her mother, and she had come into the bedroom with the pretext of showing him a deck of cards. Then she touched him with such freedom that he suffered a delusion after the initial shudder, and he felt more fear than pleasure. She asked him to come and see her that night. He agreed in order to get away, knowing that he was incapable of going. But that night, in his burning bed, he understood that he had to go see her, even if he was not capable. He got dressed by feel, listening to his brother's calm breathing, the dry cough of his father in the next room, the asthma of the hens in the courtyard, the buzz of the mosquitoes, the beating of his heart, and the inordinate bustle of a world that had not noticed until then, and he went out into the sleeping street. With all his heart, he wanted the door to be barred and not just closed as she had promised him. But it was open. He pushed it with the tips of his fingers, and the hinges yielded with a mournful and articulate moan that left a frozen echo inside of him. From the moment he entered sideways and trying not to make a noise, he caught the smell. He was still in the hallway where the woman's three brothers had their hammocks in positions that he could not see and that he could not determine in the darkness as he felt his way along the hall to push open the bedroom door and get his bearings so as to not mistake the bed. He found it. He bumped up against the ropes and the hammocks, which were lower than he had suspected, and the man who had been snoring until then turned in his sleep and said in a kind of delusion, "It was Wednesday." When he pushed open the bedroom door, he could not prevent it from scraping against the uneven floor. Suddenly, in the absolute darkness, he understood with a hopeless nostalgia that he was completely disoriented. Sleeping in the narrow room where were the mother, another daughter with her husband and two children, and the woman who may not have been there. He could have guided himself by the smell if the smell had not been all over the house, so devious and at the same time so definite as it had always been on his skin. He did not move for a long time, wondering in fright how he had ever got to that abyss of abandonment, when a hand with all its fingers extended and feeling about in the darkness touched his face. He wasn't surprised, for without knowing, he had been expecting it. Then he gave himself over to that hand, and in a terrible state of exhaustion, he let himself be led to a shapeless place where his clothes were taken off, and he was heaved about like a sack of potatoes and thrown from one side to the other in a bottomless darkness in which his arms were useless, where it no longer smelled of woman, but of ammonia, and where he tried to remember her face and found before him the face of Ursula, confusedly aware that he was doing something that for a long time he wanted to do, but that he had imagined could really never be done, not knowing what he was doing because he did not know where his feet were and where his head was, or whose feet or whose head, and feeling that he could no longer resist the glacial rumbling of his kidneys and the air of his intestines, and fear and the bewildered anxiety to flee and at the same time stay forever in an exasperated silence and that fearful solitude. Her name was Pilar Ternera. She had been part of the exodus that ended with the founding of Macondo, dragged along by her family in order to separate her from the man who had raped her at 14 and had continued to love her until she was 22, but who had never made up his mind to make his situation public because he was a man apart. He promised to follow her to the ends of the earth, but only later on when he put his affairs in order and she had become tired of waiting for him, always identifying him with the tall and short blonde and brunette men that her cards promised from land and sea within 3 days, 3 months, or 3 years. With her waiting, she had lost strength of her thighs and the firmness of her breasts, her habit of tenderness, but she kept the madness of her heart intact. Maddened by the prodigious plaything, Jose Arcadio followed her path every night through the labyrinth of the room. On a certain occasion, he found the door barred, and he knocked several times, knowing that if he had the boldness to knock the first time, he would have had to knock until the last, and after an interminable wait, she opened the door for him. During the day, lying down to stream, he would secretly enjoy the memories of the night before, but when she came into the house, merry and indifferent, chatty, he did not have to make any effort to hide his tension, because that woman whose explosive laugh frightened off the doves had nothing to do with the invisible power that taught him how to breathe from within and control his heartbeats, and that had permitted him to understand why men are afraid of death. He was so wrapped up in himself that he did not understand the joy of everyone when his father and his brother aroused the household with the news that they had succeeded in penetrating the metallic debris and had separated Ursula's gold. They had succeeded, as a matter of fact, after putting in complicated and persevering days at it. Ursula was happy, and she even gave thanks to God for the invention of alchemy, while the people of the village crushed into the laboratory and they served them guava jelly on crackers to celebrate the wonder. Jose Arcadio Buendia let them see the crucible with the recovered gold as if he had just invented it. Showing it all around, he ended up in front of his older son, who during the past few days had barely put in an appearance in the laboratory. He put the dry and yellowish mass in front of his eyes and asked him, "What does it look like to you?" "Dog shit." His father gave him a blow with the back of his hand, and that brought out blood and tears. That night, Pilar Ternera put arnica compresses on the swelling, feeling about for the bottle and cotton in the dark, and she did everything she wanted with him as long as it did not bother him, making an effort to love him without hurting him. They reached such a state of intimacy that later, without realizing it, they were whispering to each other. "I want to be alone with you," he said. "One of these days, I'm going to tell everybody, and we can stop all this sneaking around." She did not try to calm him down. "That would be fine," she said. "If we're alone, we'll leave the lamp lighted so that we can see each other, and I can holler as much as I want without anybody's having to butt in. And you can whisper in my ear any crap you can think of." That conversation, the biting rancor that he felt against his father, and the imminent possibility of wild love inspired a serene courage in him. In a spontaneous way, without any preparation, he told everything to his brother. At first, the young Aralanio understood only the risk, the immense possibility of danger that his brother's adventures implied, and he could not understand the fascination of the object. Little by little, he became contaminated with anxiety. He wondered about he wondered about the details of the dangers. He himself uh, he identified himself with the suffering and enjoyment of his brother. He felt frightened and happy. He would stay awake waiting for him until dawn in the solitary bed that seemed to have a bottom of live coals, and they would keep on talking until it was time to get up. So that both of them soon suffered from the same drowsiness, felt the same lack of interest in alchemy and the wisdom of their father, and they took refuge in solitude. Those kids are out of their heads, Ursula said. They must have worms. She prepared a repugnant potion for them made of mashed worm seed, which they both drank with unforeseen stoicism, and they sat down at the same time on their pots 11 times in a single day, expelling some rose-colored parasites that they showed to everybody with great jubilation, for it allowed them to deceive Ursula as to the origin of their distractions and drowsiness. Aurelio not only understood by then, he also lived by his brother's experiences and something of his own, for on one occasion, when the latter was explaining in great detail the mechanisms of love, he interrupted him to ask, "What does it feel like?" And Jose gave an immediate reply, "It feels like an earthquake." One January Thursday at 2 o'clock in the morning, Amaranta was born. Before anyone came into the room, Ursula examined her carefully. She was light and watery, like a newt, but all of her parts were human. Aurelio did not notice the new thing except when the house became full of people. Protected by the confusion, he went off in the search of his brother, who had not been in bed since 11 o'clock, and it was such an impulsive decision that he did not even have time to ask himself how he could get him out of Pilar Taranaya's bedroom. He circled the house for several hours, whistling private calls until the proximity of dawn forced him to go home. In his mother's room, playing with the newborn little sister, and with a face that drooped with innocence, he found Jose Arcadio. Ursula was barely over 40 days' rest when the gypsies returned. There they were, the same acrobats and jugglers that had brought the ice. Unlike Melquiades' tribe, they had shown very quickly that they were not heralds of progress, but purveyors of amusement. Even when they brought the ice, they did not advertise it for its usefulness in the life of a man, but as a simple circus curiosity. This time, along with the many other artifices, they brought a flying carpet. But they did not offer it as a fundamental contribution to the development of transport, rather as an object of recreation. The people at once dug up their last gold pieces to take advantage of a quick flight over the houses of the village. Protected by the delightful cover of collective disorder, Jose Arcadio and Pilar passed many relaxing hours. They were two happy lovers among the crowd, and they even came to suspect that love could be a feeling that was more relaxing and deep than the happiness, wild but momentary, of their secret nights. Pilar, however, broke the spell. Simulated by the enthusiasm that Jose Arcadio showed in their companionship, she confused the form and the occasion, and all of a sudden she threw the whole world on top of him. "Now you really are a man," she told him, and since he did not understand what she meant, she spelled it out to him. "You're going to be a father." Jose Arcadio did not dare leave the house for several days. It was enough for him to hear the rocking laughter of Pilar in the kitchen, to run and take refuge in the laboratory, where the artifacts of alchemy had come alive again with Ursula's blessing. Jose Arcadio Buendia received his errant son with joy and initiated him in the search for the philosopher's stone, which he had finally undertaken. One afternoon, the boys grew enthusiastic over the flying carpet that went swiftly by the laboratory at a window level, carrying the gypsy who was driving it, and several children from the village who were merrily waving their hands. But Jose Arcadio Buendia did not even look at it. Let them dream. We'll do better than flying, than we'll do better flying than they are doing, and with more scientific resources than a miserable bedspread. In spite of his feigned interest, Jose Arcadio never understood the powers of the philosopher egg, which to him looked like a poorly blown bottle. He did not succeed in escaping from his worries. He lost his appetite, and he could not sleep. He fell into an ill humor, the same as his father's over his failure of undertakings, and such was his upset that Jose Arcadio Buendia himself relieved him of the duties in the laboratory, thinking that he had taken alchemy too much to heart. Aurelio, of course, understood that his brother's affliction did not have its source in the search for the philosopher's stone, but he could not get into his confidence. He had lost his former spontaneity. From an accomplice and a communicative person, he had become a withdrawn and hostile, anxious for solitude, bitten by a virulent rancor against the world. One night he left his bed as usual, but he did not go to Pilar Tornara's house, but to mingle in the tumult of the fair. After wandering about among all kinds of contraptions without becoming interested in any of them, he spotted something that was not part of it at all. A very young gypsy girl, almost a child, who was weighted down by beads and was the most beautiful woman that Jose Arcadio had ever seen in his life. She was in the crowd that was witnessing the sad spectacle of the man who had been turned into a snake for having disobeyed his parents. Jose Arcadio paid no attention. While the sad interrogation of the snake man was taking place, he made his way through the crowd up to the first row where the gypsy girl was, and he stopped behind her. He pressed against her back. The girl tried to separate herself, but Jose Arcadio pressed more strongly against her back. Then she felt him. She remained motionless against him, trembling with surprise and fear, unable to believe the evidence. And finally, she turned her head and looked at him with a tremulous smile. At that instant, two gypsies put the snake man into the cage and carried him to the tent. The gypsy who was conducting the show announced, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to show the terrible test of the woman who must have her head chopped off every night at this time for 150 years as punishment for having seen what she should not have." Jose Arcadio and the gypsy girl did not witness the decapitation. They went to her tent, where they kissed each other with a desperate anxiety while they took off their clothes. The gypsy girl removed the starched lace corsets she had on, and there she was, changed into practically nothing. She was a languid little frog, with incipient breasts and legs so thin that they did not even match the size of Jose Arcadio's arms. But she had a decision and a warmth that compensated for her fragility. Nevertheless, Jose Arcadio did not respond to her, because they were in a kind of public tent where the gypsies passed through their circus things and did their business, and would even tarry by the bed for a game of dice. The lamp hanging from the center pole lighted the whole place up. During a pause in the caresses, Jose Arcadio stretched out naked on the bed without knowing what to do, while the girl tried to inspire him. A gypsy woman with splendid flesh came in a short time after, accompanied by a man who was not of the caravan, but who was not from the village either, and they both began to undress in front of the bed. Without meaning to, the woman looked at Jose Arcadio and examined his magnificent animal in repose with a kind of pathetic fervor. My boy, may God preserve you just as you are. Jose Arcadio's companion asked them to leave them alone, and the couple lay down on the ground, close to the bed. The passion of the others woke up Jose Arcadio's fervor. On the first contact, the bones of the girl seemed to become disjointed with a disorderly crunch, like the sound of a box of dominoes, and her skin broke into a pale sweat, and her eyes filled with tears as her whole body exhaled as a lugubrious lament and a vague smell of mud. But she bore the impact with a firmness of character and a bravery that were admirable. Jose Arcadio felt himself lifted up into the air towards a state of seraphic inspiration, where his heart burst forth with an outpouring of tender obscenities that entered the girl through her ears and came out of her mouth, translated into her language. It was Thursday. On Saturday night, Jose Arcadio wrapped a red cloth around his head and left with the gypsies. When Ursula discovered his absence, she searched for him all throughout the village. In the remains of the gypsy camp, there was nothing but a garbage pit among the still smoking ashes of the extinguished campfires. Someone who was there looking for beads among the trash told Ursula that the night before he had seen her son in the tumult of the caravan pushing the snake man's cage on a cart. He's become a gypsy, she shouted to her husband, who had not shown the slightest sign of alarm over the disappearance. I hope it's true, Jose Arcadio Buendia said, grinding in his mortar the material that had been ground 1,000 times and reheated and ground again. That way he'll learn to be a man. Ursula asked where the gypsies had gone. She went along, asking and following the road she had been shown, thinking that she had time to catch up to them. She kept getting farther away from the village until she felt so far away that she did not think about returning. Jose Arcadio Buendia did not discover that his wife was missing until 8 o'clock at night, when he left the material warming in a bed of manure and went to see what was wrong with little Amata, who was getting hoarse from crying. In a few hours he gathered a group of well-equipped men, put Amaranta in the hands of a woman who offered to nurse her, and was lost on invisible paths in pursuit of Ursula. Ariellano went with them. Some Indian fishermen, whose language they could not understand, told them with signs that they had not seen anyone pass. After 3 days of useful searching, they returned to the village. For several weeks, Jose Arcadio Buendia let himself be overcome by consternation. He took care of little Amaranta like a mother. He bathed and dressed her, took her to be nursed 4 times a day, and even sang to her at night the songs that Ursula never knew how to sing. On a certain occasion, Pilar Ternara volunteered to do the household chores until Ursula came back. Ariellano, whose mysterious intuition had become sharpened with the misfortune, felt a glow of clairvoyance when he saw her come in. Then he knew that in some inexplicable way she was to blame for his brother's flight and the consequent disappearance of his mother, and he harassed her with a silent and implacable hostility in a way that the woman did not return to the house. Time puts things in their place. Jose Arcadio Buendia and his son did not know exactly when they returned to the laboratory. Dusting things, lighting the water pipe, involved once more in the patient manipulation of the material that had been sleeping for several months in its bed of manure. Even Amaranta, lying in a wicker basket, observed with curiosity the absorbing work of her father and her brother in the small room where the air was rarefied by mercury vapors. On a certain occasion, months after Ursula's departure, strange things began to happen. An empty flask that had been forgotten in a cupboard for a long time became so heavy that it could not be moved. A pan of water on the work table boiled without any fire under it for half an hour until it completely evaporated. Jose Arcadio Buendia and his son observed those phenomena with startling excitement, unable to explain them but interpreting them as predictions of their material. One day, Amaranta's basket began to move by itself and made a complete turn about the room to the consternation of Aureliano, who hurried to stop it. But his father did not get upset. He put the basket in its place and tied it to the leg of the table, convinced that the long-awaited event was imminent. It was on that occasion that Aureliano heard him say, "If you don't fear God, fear him through the metals." Suddenly, about 5 months after her disappearance, Ursula came back. She arrived exalted, rejuvenated, with new clothes in a style that was unknown to the village. Jose Arcadio Buendia barely stood up under the impact. "That was it!" he shouted. "I knew it was going to happen." And he really believed it, for during his prolonged imprisonment, as he manipulated the material, he begged in the depth of his heart that the longed-for miracle should not be the discovery of the philosopher's stone, or the freeing of the breath that makes metals alive, or the faculty to convert hinges and the locks of house into gold, but what had happened to Ursula's return. But she did not share his excitement. She gave him a conventional kiss, as if she had been away only an hour, and told him, "Look out the door." Jose Arcadio Buendia took a long time to get out of his perplexity when he went out into the street and saw the crowd. They were not gypsies. They were men and women like them, with straight hair and dark skin, who spoke the same language and complained of the same pains. They had mules loaded down with things to eat, ox carts with furniture and domestic utensils, pure and simple earthly accessories put on sale without any fuss by peddlers of everyday reality. They came from the other side of the swamp, only 2 days away, where there were towns that received mail every month in the year, and where they were familiar with the implements of good living. Ursula had not caught up with the gypsies, but she had found the route that her husband had been unable to discover in his frustrated search for the great inventions.